969. That was Methuselah's age when he died, the oldest recorded human life in Scripture. Say it slowly and let it settle. 969 years. Then cut to the number the psalmist gives you, 70. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80. Two numbers, 9 centuries apart, and an entire biblical story compressed into the silence between them. What happened? That question has an answer, and we covered the biological mechanics in a previous video. The post-flood genealogies in Genesis 11 trace a compressing curve that mirrors exactly what genetic entropy predicts: accumulated copying errors multiplying across generations, lifespans contracting like a signal, losing power the further it travels from its source. Shem to Arphaxad, to Peleg, to Abraham. The numbers fall like a staircase into the modern range, and they do not stop falling randomly. They stop when God set the ceiling in Genesis 6:3. But here's the question that almost never gets asked. Is it permanent? Because if you keep reading past Genesis, if you follow this thread all the way through Isaiah and into Revelation, the Bible does not treat this reduction as the final word. Isaiah 65 says a man who dies at 100 in the new creation will be considered a child. Revelation 22 plants the tree of life back at the center of human habitation, the same tree whose removal in Genesis 3 was the mechanism of mortality. And Jesus, after his resurrection, sat down and ate broiled fish in a body that death could no longer touch. This video traces one unbroken arc. God shortened human lifespans deliberately, not as punishment left to run forever, but as a mercy with a specific purpose and a built-in expiration. And the same Bible that records the reduction has been quietly charting its reversal ever since. By the time we reach the end, the number 969 will not feel like a relic. It will feel like a preview. If you have seen our previous video on lifespan, treat this section as orientation, not argument. The genetic entropy lens is already in your hands. We are just confirming where we are on the map before we move forward. The post-flood genealogy in Genesis 11 is not a random scatter of numbers. It is a directional curve, and direction is the key word. Every generation steps down. The arc does not flatten, does not reverse, does not plateau at some new equilibrium. It compresses consistently across 10 generations in a pattern that matches what modern geneticists who study genomic degradation would predict from accumulating replication errors in a population moving through successive bottlenecks. Walk the numbers with me. Adam, 930 years. Shem, one of Noah's sons born into the new post-flood world, 600. His son Arphaxad, 438. Peleg, 4 generations out, 239. Abraham, whom God calls out of Ur to begin the covenant story, 175. The curve is not subtle, it is steep, consistent, and it does not stop until it reaches the range where most of us now live, where a long life means reaching 80, and anything beyond that feels extraordinary. The lifespan that was once ordinary has become a miracle. Genesis 6:3 is the hinge point. God says, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years." Many scholars read this not as a countdown to the flood, but as the new biological ceiling God was establishing for the post-fall, post-flood human condition. And the genealogies confirm it. The reduction does not happen all at once, but across generations it pulls every human lifespan toward that ceiling with the steady gravity of biological law. Pre-flood conditions, the water canopy, elevated atmospheric pressure, the absence of direct UV radiation, had provided an environmental buffer against the worst effects of genomic degradation. Once those conditions changed, the buffer was gone, and the decay curve became visible in the historical record itself. We are not here to reprove any of that. That is the established context. The question this video is built around starts one layer deeper. Why did God do it? And once you have that answer, the harder question becomes unavoidable. If the reduction was purposeful, does its purpose eventually end? Here is the reframe that changes everything. We tend to read the lifespan reduction as part of the curse, collateral damage from the fall, entropy just doing what entropy does, God stepping back and letting biology take its course. But Genesis 6 does not read that way. The sealing in verse 3 is not passive. God speaks it. He sets it. This is not abandonment. This is containment. Look at the context. Genesis 6:5 follows almost immediately. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The pre-flood world had long-lived people. And what did they do with that longevity? They compounded evil across centuries. A man who lives 900 years has 900 years to corrupt, to accumulate power without accountability, to spread patterns of violence across generations in ways that shorter lives simply cannot sustain. The flood is not God overreacting to a bad century. It is God responding to what happens when fallen human nature operates without any biological boundary on its time. The mercy logic runs like this. Limit the biological window, and you limit the compounding. A 70-year lifespan is still long enough to do real damage. History makes that obvious. But it is short enough that no single corrupted human pattern can permanently entrench itself before death interrupts it, and the next generation inherits a partially reset slate. Redemption history requires that interruption. The covenant with Abraham, the exodus from Egypt, the law at Sinai, the incarnation of God in first-century Judea, the cross, the resurrection. None of these events unfolds in a world where the same corrupted rulers and the same hardened populations persist across 8 centuries without dying. The reduction created the structure within which the story could move. This is what makes the lifespan reduction a feature of the plan, rather than a flaw in it. It was not God giving up on biological flourishing. It was God compressing the timeline of fallen history so that redemption history had room to breathe. And here is what that implies. A mercy that shortens because the purpose requires shortening will restore when the purpose is complete. The reduction was always meant to be temporary. It had an endpoint. And 2 books of the Bible tell you exactly what that endpoint looks like. Isaiah 65 is one of the most specific biological texts in all of prophetic scripture, and it rarely gets treated with the precision it deserves. Starting at verse 17, God announces a new creation, new heavens, new earth, and then immediately starts describing what life inside that new creation looks like. Not abstractly, not metaphorically, in concrete, embodied terms that would make no sense if the text were only describing a spiritual state. Verse 20 is the key verse, and it deserves to be read slowly. No more shall there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not fill out his years, for the young man shall die 100 years old, and the sinner who dies at 100 years will be accursed. Read that again. A man who dies at 100 years old will be considered young. That sentence has only one possible biological implication. Lifespans in the new creation dramatically exceed anything in the current age. 100 years is not old age in Isaiah's new creation. It is early death. It is the exception, not the norm. The baseline has shifted so dramatically upward that what we now call a long life does not even register as a complete one. And the surrounding verses will not let you spiritualize it away. People in Isaiah's new creation build houses and live in them. They plant vineyards and eat the fruit themselves. They bear children. They have labor that produces results they personally enjoy rather than labor that is stolen or frustrated. This is embodied, physical, temporally extended life. Life that has weight, history, continuity, and biological duration. The new creation in Isaiah 65 is not a place where bodies become irrelevant. It is a place where bodies finally work the way they were designed to work. When you map those conditions back against the genetic entropy lens, the implication is striking. The only way Isaiah's new creation biology is possible is if the mechanisms driving genomic degradation are no longer operative. Something in the biological environment, or something in the biological architecture of the people themselves, has changed in a way that removes the compressing pressure of entropy. Isaiah does not use the vocabulary of genetics, but the conditions he describes require a biological reality that genetic entropy, operating normally, cannot produce. The reduction had an endpoint. Isaiah 65 is the Old Testament's answer to the question Genesis 6 raised, and it names the shape of what restoration looks like before the New Testament gives us the mechanism. To understand what Revelation 22 is doing, you have to feel the weight of Genesis 3:24. After the fall, after the sentence is pronounced, after Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, God places cherubim and a flaming sword at the entrance, specifically to guard the way to the tree of life. That is not incidental. The text is telling you why the exile matters biologically, because the tree of life is still there, still bearing fruit, and access to it has been permanently revoked. The mortality of the fallen human condition is not just a legal verdict. It is enforced by physical exile from the biological mechanism that would sustain indefinite life. Revelation 22:1-2 opens with a river flowing from the throne of God through the middle of the New Jerusalem, and on either side of that river stands the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and carrying leaves that bring healing to the nations. Every element of that image is doing structural work. 12 fruits every month. This is not decorative abundance, it is harvest language, the language of consistent, reliable biological provision. The leaves carry healing, not symbolic comfort, but the kind of restoration that Genesis 3 revoked when the tree became inaccessible. The tree is not back as a monument to Eden. It is back as a functioning biological system at the center of human habitation. Verse 3 makes it explicit. No longer will there be any curse. That single sentence formally revokes the theological sentence of Genesis 3, not just its spiritual consequences, the full curse, the one that included thorns and pain and the return to dust. The same authority that imposed the biological decay is now formally lifting it. The exile of Genesis 3:24 is not extended into eternity. It is reversed. The cherubim and the flaming sword stand down, and what they were guarding becomes permanently accessible again. The New Jerusalem in Revelation is structured as an expanded Eden, a temple garden at cosmic scale, with the river of life running through it the way the river of Eden ran through the original garden. And at the center of that structure, doing the work it was always designed to do, is the tree whose removal was the mechanism of mortality. Its return is not a spiritual reward appended to the end of history. It is the architectural completion of a structure whose foundation was laid in Genesis 2. The arc that began with exile from a biological mechanism ends with permanent, unrestricted access to it. Everything we have traced so far, Isaiah's new creation, biology, Revelation's restored tree, the formal revocation of the curse, could remain in the register of future promise. Something to believe, something to hope for, but nothing yet demonstrated in the physical world. And then Jesus walks out of a tomb on the third day, and the category changes entirely. Luke 24 is almost insistent about the physicality. When Jesus appears to the disciples, their first instinct is to assume they are seeing a ghost, a disembodied spirit, the kind of post-death existence that makes intuitive sense. Jesus does not allow that interpretation. He shows them his hands and his feet. He tells them to touch him, to feel that he has flesh and bones. And then, as if to remove any remaining ambiguity, he asks if they have anything to eat, and he eats broiled fish in front of them. This is not a ghost. This is not a vision. This is a physical body, occupying space, ingesting food, capable of being touched and felt and seen in ordinary daylight. John adds further texture. Mary Magdalene mistakes him for a gardener until he speaks her name. Thomas, famously, is invited to put his hand into the wound in Jesus' side. The disciples on the road to Emmaus walk with him for miles without recognizing him. He stands on the shore of the Sea of Galilee and calls to his disciples on the water. He builds a charcoal fire and cooks breakfast. These are not the actions of a spirit or a metaphor. They are the actions of a person with a body that works, that eats, that speaks, that makes fire, that walks roads. Yet this body operates entirely outside the constraints that define every other post-fall physical existence. No decay, no vulnerability to disease or injury or death. The same entropy that has been compressing human lifespans since the flood has no purchase on this body whatsoever. This is a biological category that had never existed before that morning. A physical body fully real, fully embodied, fully capable of interacting with the material world, but free from the genomic degradation that makes current biology fragile and mortal. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 reaches for the sharpest language he can find to describe the contrast. Sown in corruption, raised in incorruption. Sown in dishonor, raised in glory. Sown in weakness, raised in power. Sown a natural body, raised a spiritual body. Run that through the genetic entropy lens. The body sown in corruption is the body carrying millennia of accumulated genomic error, the body that wears out, that ages, that dies. The body raised in incorruption is the original master file biology, copied without error, entropy not merely halted but reversed. The spiritual body Paul describes is not less physical than the natural body. It is more fully physical, freed from the degradation that makes current biology temporary and fragile. It is what a physical body looks like when the curse has been formally lifted and the tree of life is no longer barred. Jesus is not the exception to the new creation biology. He is the first instance of it. What Isaiah described as future, what Revelation maps as the architecture of the age to come, Jesus' resurrection made it concrete, datable, and verifiable by the people who touched the wounds. The restoration that Genesis 3 made necessary, that Isaiah promised, that Revelation depicts at full scale, it already happened once in a garden in Jerusalem early on the first day of the week. Step back now and look at the whole shape. Eden's biology was not humanity's ceiling. It was the floor. Adam in Genesis 2 was not the peak of what human biological life could be. He was the starting condition, before entropy had run a single generation, before the fall had introduced the mechanisms of death, before the exile had removed access to the one biological structure designed to sustain indefinite life. 930 years at the end of a life already compromised by the fall. Imagine the baseline before it was compromised. The new creation is not a return to Adam's state, it is a surpassing of it. Adam was biological and mortal, capable of dying, requiring the tree of life to sustain him, vulnerable in a way the resurrection body is not. The body Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 15, the body Jesus demonstrated in the 40 days between resurrection and ascension, is not a reset to Eden. It is an upgrade beyond Eden. Incorruption built into the architecture, not sustained by external access to a tree but woven into the biology itself. Adam needed the tree. The resurrection body is what the tree was pointing toward. This is the full arc. God created biological life with extraordinary longevity and gave it a mechanism for indefinite sustenance. The fall introduced corruption, biological, moral, spiritual, and God's response was not to abandon his creation, but to contain the damage. The lifespan reduction was that containment. Mercy in the form of limits, buying the time and the space redemption history required. And redemption history, once it reached its own culmination in the resurrection of Jesus, began the reversal. The prototype exists. The promise is mapped in Isaiah. The mechanism is restored in Revelation. The curse is formally lifted in the last chapter of the last book. The number 969 is not a relic of a world that is gone. It is a data point pointing toward a world that is coming. A world where Isaiah's 100-year-old is still considered young, where the tree at the center of the city bears fruit every month, and where the body that death once had the last word over has been raised in a form death cannot reach. The arc that began in Genesis 2 does not end in a graveyard. It ends in a garden. The same garden, made new, made permanent, made complete. The reduction was not the story's ending. It was the middle chapter, the necessary compression that made room for the cross, for the resurrection, and ultimately for the restoration those events guarantee. If this arc is something you want to keep following, subscribe and stay close. We are going to keep tracing these threads through Scripture with the same precision and the same respect for what the text is actually saying. If this video gave you something worth thinking about, share it with someone who is asking the same questions. We will see you in the next one.